Welcome to the Reality Taboo. It's April 25th, 2025. We're going to start this episode talking once again about the stabbing in Frisco, Texas. Brief recaps. In early April 2025, a 17-year-old teenage boy, white boy named Austin Metcalf was stabbed by a 17-year-old black kid named Carmelo Anthony. And there's some dispute over what led up to the events, but Carmelo Anthony, the black kid, was in the wrong tent at a track meet, at a high school track meet, and Austin Metcalf, the white kid, told Carmelo Anthony to get out of the tent. Things escalated, and there's some dispute whether Austin Metcalf put his hands on Carmelo Anthony, but Carmelo Anthony had a knife in his bag and stabbed and killed Austin Metcalf. And within hours of the stabbing, Austin Metcalf's dad, Jeff Metcalf, said that he forgave Carmelo Anthony for stabbing and killing his son. And as we covered a couple weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, the Carmelo Anthony family held a press conference. And essentially, I would describe the purpose of the event was to reframe the narrative and make Carmelo Anthony and his family the victims, and to make this a racial angle and play up the racial angle and reframe it as part of the black experience in America. And so at that press conference, Jeff Metcalf made an unexpected appearance and was asked to leave the building and was escorted out of the building by the police. And so some new information that was not publicly available at the time of our recording a couple weeks ago when we last covered this story. Jeff Metcalf claimed that his purpose in attending the press conference was to pray with the Carmelo Anthony family and show that they were, quote, united. Now, what they were supposedly united about, I'm not sure, but his efforts were unsuccessful, as actually at that very same press conference, which we did cover, Dominique Alexander, the Carmelo Anthony's family's spokesperson, a sort of Al Sharpton wannabe, said that Jeff Metcalf had, quote, felled into bigotry and racism. So despite Jeff Metcalf's best efforts to make everybody know that he's not a racist and this isn't a racial attitude, the result is still the same, that the Carmelo Anthony family is claiming that he has felled into racism and bigotry nonetheless.
I don't know if I'd quite describe it as a nonetheless situation. This was clearly for public consumption. Presumably, if Jeff Metcalf was trying to maximize the congruence that the two sides of this unfortunate incident had shared, then he would have contacted them ahead of time. By showing up uninvited, he was guaranteeing that he was going to be able to be there, and that some sort of public reaction would be the consequence of it. If we go back to expected value, the calculations that we were talking about in the previous episode when we were assessing this case, the situation is such that both Jeff Metcalf, his best outcome is arrived at by claiming that this is not racial. There's no racial angle involved here. There's no racial angle to be assessed, and there is no racial animus coming from him towards the Anthony family. Conversely, the best outcome potential, the best expected value outcome for the Anthony side of things is to accuse Metcalf of being racist. So it makes the most sense for Metcalf to say that he is not racist, and it makes the most sense for Anthony to say that the Metcalf family is racist. The idea that the Anthony family would publicly accept Metcalf's disclaimer that he is not in any way racist, or that his son was in any way racially motivated, something that there is no way that they're going to grant that. But even though they aren't going to grant that, and even though they're going to accuse Metcalf of being racist, it still makes the most sense for Metcalf to claim that he is not racist.
Ness, I take your point on the EV theory. There are a few things that I'm not sure how it fits into that. For one thing, Jeff Metcalf's EV, I think, is now lower because of his actions over the last few weeks since his son was murdered. I think he's lowered his EV as compared to what his EV would be if he had just done nothing, had essentially done a media blackout and said, we're grieving, we're not going to talk to the press, and had basically stayed at home. So maybe he's just made a miscalculation. He thought that his actions of forgiving Carmelo Anthony and attending the press conference and saying he wants to pray and pray with the Carmelo Anthony family, and that he wants to shut down any sort of racialization of this by whites. Maybe all those things are miscalculation. He thought those things would increase his EV, but they actually decreased it. I think we actually have almost like a control group we have Austin Metcalf's mother and Austin Metcalf's twin brother, who have given far, far less interviews and have been much, basically not in the spotlight at all. There's one interview I saw where they were, I would say, contrasted with Jeff Metcalf. They were acting as one would expect a grieving family to act, where they were clearly distraught and said explicitly that they were not prepared to forgive Carmelo Anthony for killing their son and brother. And again, I think if Jeff Metcalf had taken their approach, the EV of the collective EV of the Metcalf family would be higher now than it is.
I don't disagree with that the general parameters of that assessment. We don't know, of course, behind the scenes if there was pressure put on the Metcalf family to make a public statement offering forgiveness and trying to promote healing and understanding, forgiveness, unification. It's conjecture, but I wouldn't be surprised if CRS contacted the Metcalf family after that interview that the mother and brother gave, or probably have a continuing line of communication with the Metcalf family, encouraging them gently that offering forgiveness is the best way forward in a difficult environment. And if they were emotionally distraught, if they were uncomfortable in going in front of the media further, it's not difficult to imagine a situation where Jeff Metcalf, as the father, says that he will be the point person for the family, interacting with the public and with the media from that point going forward. And the case is still young. There are a lot of factors that will be introduced in the future. I predict, for one, that Anthony's defense will certainly, in many ways, attempt to impugn the character of the late Austin Metcalf and his family when the defense gets discovery and when they dig into the social networks of these boys. These twins were athletes, high school varsity boys. The chance that they didn't make some off-colored comments at some point in their high school careers is infinitesimally small, and I think it quite likely that there will be some number of students that go to the school or people who have interacted with the Metcalfs in some way that will say that, oh yeah, I heard him one time joking in the bathroom, making racist jokes or laughing at a racist joke or singing the lyrics to some rap song where they said the N-word. There are a lot of different situations that will be able to come up, and that's assuming that those that the evidence is legitimate. They could also just fabricate it or have someone who wants the attention, because any person who comes forward and goes along with impugning the integrity of the Metcalfs is going to get a ton of favorable media attention. So it'll be an easy way to gain 15 minutes of fame by being the person who brings forward that accusation. And so what Jeff Metcalf could be doing now is anticipating that potentially, or even if he's not anticipating it, it does make sense, just understanding the broader zeitgeist, that the accusations of racism will be an integral part of the self-defense case that the Anthony side is going to put forward. And so anything that he can do to try to diffuse that, he's going to do. Jeff Metcalf is going to do.
As part of that apparent strategy on the Metcalf's part, Jeff Metcalf has hired his own black spokesman, just as the Carmelo Anthony family hired Dominique Alexander as their black spokesman. Jeff Metcalf has apparently brought on board, I don't know if he's paying him or in what exactly the capacity is, but Jeff Metcalf has brought on a man named Bruce C. Carter. He is, looking at his website, it's some sort of public relations firm that Bruce C. Carter has. It's more than your usual public relations firm. And since 2016, Bruce Carter has helped companies and individuals implement their creative visions and fight their battles. That's coming from Bruce Carter's website. And he also has an organization called BMW, Black Males Winning. It seems like a sort of an advocacy organization for black people and trying to improve their situation. There was last weekend, so about a week ago, this would have been April 19th, there was some sort of rally at the site of near the parking lot, I believe, of the sports stadium where the stabbing occurred. So on April 19th, there was a rally, and somebody named Jake Lang organized this event. And he was basically, I would say, trying to make it into a racial issue in the sense of drawing attention to all the violence perpetrated by black people against white people and the vastly disproportional amount of violence that black people inflict on white people as compared to the opposite. And somehow Jake Lang was able to get on the phone outside the stadium in the parking lot, was able to get on the phone with Jeff Metcalf via the interlocutor of Bruce Carter. So Bruce Carter was holding up the phone to Jake Lang, and on the phone was Jeff Metcalf. So I had to give a lot of context for this clip that I'm about to play to make sense. So here's the clip.
Go ahead, Jake.
Hey, Jeff, it's Jake Lang here. Jeff, first of all, my entire heart rests in your hands. I would be in my position, not even as somebody that knew your son, but somebody that shares the same understanding. I grew up as a 17-year-old young white man too, and I grew up in fear of my life around black people because they were killing and robbing people around me all the time. And I don't understand, as I was a father, you could sit idly by and not condemn the culture that killed your son. There is an epidemic problem in this country, and your voice could be one of the loudest voices in this country, but you've chosen to recoil out of fear and continue the suppression. Why will you not stand with me and with the rest of the people? We're not calling for racial divide. We're not calling for hatred. We're saying 350,000 attacks on white people by black people a year in this country is wrong. Why can't you stand that and say with that? Maybe you can. Would you be willing to stand by me in a press conference or in an individual interview and talk about this issue that is larger than Austin at this point? God rest a beautiful young man's soul that would have been one of our strongest voices if he was still alive today.
Are you done?
Yes, I am, sir.
Okay, my turn to speak. You are part of the fucking problem, my friend. You're trying to create more race divide than bridging the gap. I do not condone anything you do. You do not have any fucking...
That's called white guilt.
No, let it talk, buddy. My son, let me finish. I give you your time. You take my son's face off your website. I am not associated with you.
You're creating more Austin Metcalfs with your weakness, sir.
I
You are creating more Austin Metcalf.
Black man here, you are being weak. I gotta be honest with you about that, sir.
You're being weak. Condemn your son's killer and the culture that caused it.
Hey, Jeff.
That's the problem.
Jeff.
I'll handle it from here.
So Ness's EV argument, I think, lines up here, or the way it would apply in this situation is Jeff Metcalf believes that he can increase his EV by distancing himself from any sort of group that is trying to make this racial issue, in the sense of using it to highlight how much violence black people inflict against white people. But what stood out to me the most was that Jeff Metcalf has presented this sort of compassionate persona that is willing to forgive somebody who committed a heinous act against his son. And you can see that it's really not as universal. This compassion is not a universal thing, because it's not that Jeff Metcalf doesn't hate. It's just he has very clear objects of hate, and he has far more contempt for a white person who is drawing attention, using his son's death to draw attention to black on white violence. Jeff Metcalf has far more contempt for somebody who would do that than for the person who killed his son. And it wasn't in this clip. It was later some sort of statement that Jeff Metcalf made about Lang and his the rally, or the event he was holding. Jeff Metcalf called Lang and the people associated with him, quote, white trash. So it actually does appear that Jeff Metcalf is okay with racism, just so long as the racism is directed against white people.
As Jeff was speaking, I did a little homework that I should have done previously. My apologies for coming in unprepared. I didn't realize that the parents of Metcalf were divorced. I think that changes the potential EV calculation significantly. It is not necessarily a situation where you have a paternal head of the household trying to do what is best for the family with regards to the outside world, almost irrespective of what led to the divorce that occurred, that the family is separated almost definitionally shows that the well-being of his sons is not his top priority. And so his expected value calculation could be one that is distinctly at odds with that of his remaining son and his former wife. And so I think that fills in some of the details as to why he might be making the approach that he's making. This could very much be to boost his own public profile, to position himself as the Christian anti-racist here. And those two things don't necessarily need to be diametrically opposed to one another. He could be, in a certain sense, taking the onus off of his ex-wife and his surviving son and putting it on himself and making himself more of the center of attention. And that could redound to his benefit, but it could also redound to theirs as well, even if they're not on the same page. The directions that they're taking with regards to how they publicly face in the wake of this tragedy, those two things could be different, but still at the same time be working in the same direction, even if they're not coordinating directly. Continuing in the realm of conjecture, it's also not difficult to imagine that Jeff Metcalf is feeling some guilt that his son was killed in an altercation with another boy when both of them are newly minted men, are coming into their own adulthoods, and he as the father isn't present there to give his son the daily guidance that any testosterone-laden athlete at the age of 16, 17, 18 needs.
Jeff Metcalf professes to be a strong Christian, and that his Christian faith motivates and guides him. So I want to ask a perhaps provocative question. Is Jeff Metcalf a modern-day Job or a Christ cuck? And I'm embarrassed to say I have not read the book of Job, but my understanding of the story is that Job is a paragon of piety and honors God, and so God seeks to test Job's faith by stripping away everything that Job cares about, his family, his wealth. And despite it all, Job remains faithful to God and is eventually rewarded with a new family. And the definition I found of Christcuck is as follows: a derogatory term for a Christian who is seen as excessively submissive, self-sacrificing, or naively forgiving in ways that undermine their own people, values, or interests, often out of misplaced virtue or fear of moral judgment. So I'm going to turn it over. What do you think, Ness?
To be a bit of a nitpicker, in the book of Job, it's the devil that tempts Job, that brings the challenge to God, that he will be able to successfully tempt Job to turn on God. It's not God who is going to spontaneously try to test Job's faith, but he does take everything away from Job, and then when Job maintains the faith, he gives Job everything back and then some for maintaining his devotion and piety through the duration of the test. I think the question Jeff raises is an interesting one, but I think it grants way too much credit to Jeff Metcalf. The idea that he is doing this as some stoutly devout Christian is a little bit laughable in the face of, again, this newly discovered information on my part that he's divorced. There is no question that the Bible is far more strongly condemning of divorce than it is of racism. Racism isn't condemned in the Bible at all. It's not a sin, but divorce clearly is. I'm going to read here from the words of Jesus himself with regards to divorce. Reading from Matthew 19, starting in verse 4, quoting Jesus. "At the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." This is the Son of God, the same God who, in the book of Joshua, commands Joshua to genocide an entire population of Canaanites, commanding the Israelites to put every one of them, women and children included, to the sword. And so in that context, it's difficult to take seriously a man who feigns moral outrage over the sin of racism, who is himself divorced and was not present, at least not as directly present in the lives of his children as he could have been, and as he is in fact biblically instructed to be.
I'm going to hedge a little bit on the question of whether Jeff Metcalf is a Christ cuck or a modern-day Job. I think he could be both. And what I mean is, first I'll say from a orthodox, traditional view of Christianity, I would say he is a Christ cuck. However, from the more modern, woke Christianity that, to be honest, is in some ways more prevalent in the West in 2025. I would say that sort of woke rainbow flags in front of churches, gay pastors, blessing gay marriages, holding gay marriages at church. That's all that sort of thing. From that, whatever ideology you want to call that, I would argue it's not Christianity, but it at least wears the skin of Christianity. I would say from that perspective, Jeff is a modern-day Job, because despite all of the hardship that he is facing and the events that contradict his worldview, what I mean by that is he believes that any sort of issues that the Black African American community in America faces today are primarily the result of racism and structural issues. That sort of mindset that he seems to hold. That view of the world can hardly think of something that would contradict or challenge that worldview more than his son being unjustifiably stabbed in the heart by a black kid. And yet, despite that, Jeff Metcalf seems to be holding to the faith and retaining his worldview. And then a couple quick asides. I want to quibble a little bit. I don't want to derail us into a debate about theology, but I do want to just point out that I agree that racism per se is not condemned in the Bible. It's not clearly condemned as a sin. However, I think if you look at the totality of the Bible, I think you could at least make a reasonable claim that certain forms of racism are sinful. And then number two, I would say I certainly think genocide is directly commanded. I agree. It was directly commanded by God. However, that is in the Old Testament. I believe that that is because the Jews or the Hebrews in the Old Testament were the sole possessors of divine right or the grace of God. However, when Jesus came, that grace was expanded to everyone in the world who accepted Jesus as his Savior. Therefore, genocide was much less acceptable at that point. The only permissible use of genocide, I would say, after Jesus would be if some ethnic group refused to recognize Jesus as God.
A few points here. One, again, if there is the argument to be made that racism can be teased out as a sort of sin in the Bible, it is a sin that became one at some particular point, but that wasn't always a sin, and in fact was a commandment of God that then in the future flipped into going from being a commandment to being a sin. That compared to the clear condemnation of, say, homosexuality or divorce or any of the other beliefs that are favored by the modern zeitgeist, that I don't know Jeff Metcalf's position on those things. Well, I know on divorce, at least based on the evidence, that it is not something that he is as hot and bothered about as he appears to be about racism, even though divorce is clearly more sinful and more problematic from a Christian perspective than racism is. But to get back to the idea that in the Old Testament that God commanded a genocide, it was, in fact, because the Canaanites were unbelievers. That was part of it. Old Testament Christianity, or Judaism, if you want to call it that at the time, although I think that's a little bit anachronistic to do that. But if you were to look at it in that way, was not as evangelical as Christianity would become post-Christ, but the unbelievers that Joshua put to the sword were being punished for that disobedience and unbelief in God. And I sincerely doubt that Jeff Metcalf, because recall that Jesus condemns unbelievers to a fate of having millstones tied around their necks and thrown to the bottom of the sea. And so I very much doubt that Jeff Metcalf would say that racism is problematic as long as that racism is directed against Christians. But if the racism is directed against Muslims or East Asians or animistic Sub-Saharan Africans, that there's no problem with that. That clearly is not the case. So I guess the most magnanimous way I could look at his orientation, if it is authentic, is that he feels a call towards anti-racism on account of his Christianity at a visceral level, but that he hasn't examined that at all, because if he did, it would crumble immediately. But I think it's more likely it's much more cynical than that, or if not cynical, infected by the modern anti-Christian age that wears the trappings of Christianity as a skin suit. The problem I see with the comparison to Job, I think we could also make a comparison here to Abraham and the willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac to propitiate God in the same way that Job did by refusing to let his faith in God be shaken to its core. In both cases, God repaid those men tenfold. Their futures were much brighter because of their steadfast devotion to God. And if this is the new God of the age, perhaps what Jeff Metcalf is doing will redound to his benefit, and he will become some sort of popular anti-racist Christian figure. But I think it more likely that he is going to find that praying to the temple of this false god is not going to redound to his benefit, that he's not going to be blessed for it, but that sadly instead he is going to be cursed. So rather than a Christ cuck or a Job, I would put him more in the camp of a Judas Iscariot.
Well, I'm certainly not on Team Jeff Metcalf. I think comparing him to Judas is a bit much, as Dante put Judas in the ninth circle of hell, the very bottom rung of hell, as the worst of the worst. I don't think Jeff Metcalf belongs there. But as they say these days, defending Jeff Metcalf, I would not have predicted it'd be on my bingo card for 2025, but here I am.
Well, at the risk of wading too deeply into theological waters, I don't think Jesus, if he was constructing Dante's narrative, would have put Judas at the ninth level of hell either.
Well, which circle do you think he belongs in then? Where would Jesus have put him?
That's a tough question. I am already skirting close enough to the edge of sacrilege, if unintentionally, that I don't want to try to put myself into the mind of Jesus and make decisions that I suspect he would make on questions like this that aren't so clear. Jesus took Judas in as one of the 12 disciples, broke bread with him, taught with him, trusted him to effectively be the treasurer of Jesus's ministry as he traveled through Roman Palestine. None of Jesus's disciples were without rebuke from Jesus at some point during the Gospels, during the story of the Gospels. They all sinned. Peter probably most famously after Judas, but the death and resurrection, the sacrifice, was something that was preordained. It was a prophecy fulfilled, and so there had to be some mechanism for that to occur, and Judas was that mechanism. Ultimately, Judas did deeply regret what he had done. He thought it was a sin, in fact, so heinous that no redemption would be forthcoming to him, and that was what his most devastating decision was, not to turn Jesus over to the Jews, to petition Rome to have him crucified. What did Judas in, what ended up having him hang from the devil's tree and descend into hell, if he is at the ninth circle, it is only because he refused to put his sin, the load of his sin, to Jesus to be forgiven. He thought he was beyond forgiveness, and one of the most important teachings of Christianity, of course, is that no one is beyond redemption, because redemption is something granted by God through the sacrifice of Jesus. Every man would be condemned utterly, irrespective of how well they lived, if not for the grace of God. And conversely, no matter how heinous someone acts, the grace of God is still more than enough to repay the debt owed. And so Judas's biggest sin was, again, not repenting and then asking for forgiveness. Dante had numerous popes in various circles of hell, and so my best guess is that Jesus would not put Judas at the very ninth level. Would Judas be at a lower level of hell than, say, the recently deceased Pope Francis? I'm not sure. I think it's an open question. Judas brought countless people to Christianity, whereas Pope Francis has probably turned millions of them away. Judas was not celebrated by the corrupt world that he existed in, while Francis most certainly was. Before we close off here, I want to jarringly switch gears to point out an article from Zero Hedge about Japan's demographic implosion. Quote, Japan's already collapsing population just posted its biggest annual drop on record, falling by 898,000 people as of last October compared to a year earlier. This marked the 14th consecutive year of population decline in the country. Man, how time flies. I remember writing in the mid-aughts about the impending drop in population that was on the horizon for South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, if memory serves, as the first three countries where they were going to post absolute declines in their population, something that up to that point was outside of war had not happened in a century in any developed country anywhere on the globe. And now here we are a couple of decades later, and that's how the very simple math accounting works out, that this is the 14th year in a row since that threshold was reached, and the population has continued to decline. And in tandem with this population decline comes an inversion of the population age pyramid that creates a situation where the proportion of the population that is under the age of 18 declines, while the proportion of the population over the age of 65 continues to grow. And that change in the distribution of the population coincides with an absolute decline in the number of people overall. This problem is even more intractable and insidious than it appears at first blush, because it has a snowball effect. The snowball effect is a strategic conception in which some advantage inherently provides additional advantage, and the rate of growth is exponential, such that once something begins to set in motion, it perpetually grows to the point that each instant in time that you move forward, it becomes less and less possible to stop what has already begun. Literally that of a snowball rolling down a hill and gathering more and more snow and more weight and force as it moves. If you're a game designer, you don't want snowball effects. Those are problematic. They ruin the play experience because they create situations where a small advantage then quickly becomes insurmountable. So to turn to something I'm familiar with, and bear with me, I will expand this out so that it becomes hopefully more relevant to a broader audience, and then I will tie it back to how this relates to Japan's situation. But in the current standard meta in Magic the Gathering, there is the card Up the Beanstalk that sees playing about 7% of decks, and yet is under the banhammer scrutiny currently because it is the most snowbally of snowball cards, whereas something like Beza the Bounding Spring that has 3 times the play is the ultimate blowtorch flaming sword that melts the snowball. When Beza the Bounding Spring enters, create a treasure token if an opponent controls more lands than you. You gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 1/1 blue fish creature tokens if an opponent controls more creatures than you. Draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. Another game that more people will be familiar with that utilizes that flaming sword to to melt the snowball effect is a game like Mario Kart, where absent that intervention, simply getting to the front of the pack creates its own snowball effect, because as the other racers midway in the pack are hitting each other with items and bumping into each other, causing each other problems, the person who is up front is able to avoid all of that and just keep driving unmolested, and thereby able to easily extend the initial lead that they gain. But the designers of Mario Kart fix this problem with items that heavily handicap in favor of those who would otherwise be the victims of the snowball effect, by giving them flaming swords like stars and blue shells and lightning bolts and all of these other things that make the gameplay experience a lot more fun because it keeps it competitive. Bringing that back to Japan, though, because the age pyramid is inverted and inverting worse and worse as the population drops farther and farther, it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because more and more of the resources and the cultural focus is devoted to maintaining the comfort and fulfilling the preferences of an aged, increasingly senescent geriatric population, such that less and less focus is paid to the dwindling percentage of the population that is young and potentially able to reverse the demographic problems. democracy and the Oriental tendency to honor the elderly, that combined with democracy creates a political situation in addition to the demographic situation, the sheer numbers of the demographic problem. Those things come together to create a situation where it's very difficult to reverse the problem because there isn't the focus on the problem, there isn't the incentive to fix the problem, and the sheer economic challenges of having a dwindling productive population carry the burden of an increasingly non-productive population of elderly creates one of two outcomes: either a continued demographic death spiral or a call to open up the ports of entry of Japan to usher in vibrant, young, hungry immigrants to revitalize a dying, moribund Japan. And what necessarily is wrong with that? If Japan doesn't have the motivation to keep itself alive, to reproduce itself, to maintain its civilization, why shouldn't somebody else be given a chance?
We've already established on previous episodes that I am a weeaboo, and I don't think we define that, but that is basically a non-Japanese person, usually a white guy who loves Japan and Japanese culture. I would answer that question, it would be a horrible thing, because Japan truly is a remarkable country with a remarkable history and cultural traditions, and those traditions and culture exist because Japanese people exist. And so tautologically, if there are no Japanese people, there's no Japanese culture. So I think I'm speaking for both of us at the Reality Taboo. We're rooting for Japan.
Most definitely. I rib Jeff for his weebishness, but I am certainly rooting for the Japanese. It would be nice if for once the East led the way and innovated something that we could copy instead of the other way around. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. We'll talk to you next time.